There is a quiet truth about books that almost no one talks about. Books don't change your life the moment you finish the last page. They change you slowly, invisibly, over time, while you're not paying attention. Most people approach books the same way they approach motivation. They read something inspiring. They feel something. And then, life continues exactly the same. That's not because books are weak. It's because transformation doesn't happen through excitement. It happens through repetition, time, and quiet discipline. This audiobook is not about reading more books. It's about letting a few books stay with you long enough to change how you think. Because real change doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't come with fireworks or sudden confidence. It shows up later, in the way you pause before reacting, and in the way you choose long-term clarity over short-term comfort, in the way your inner voice sounds calmer, firmer, and more grounded than it used to. Most people read to escape their life for a moment. Very few read to redesign how they live, and that difference matters. If you've ever finished a book and thought, this was good, but nothing really changed, this audiobook is for you. Because the problem was never the book. The problem was how long you stayed with it. Ideas don't change you when you hear them once. They change you when they start repeating themselves inside your mind. When they show up in moments of stress, decision, and doubt. That requires time. 6 months may not sound impressive in a world obsessed with instant results. But 6 months of consistent reading, done quietly, and without chasing motivation, can completely reshape how you see yourself and your life. Not because you're forcing change, but because your thinking slowly evolves. You stop arguing with reality. You stop reacting emotionally to everything. You stop chasing approval that doesn't matter. And none of this happens loudly. The books that truly change people are rarely the ones that hype them up. They are the ones that challenge assumptions, the ones that sit uncomfortably with you, the ones you think about weeks later while driving, walking, or lying awake at night. These are not books you consume. These are books you live with. And when you live with an idea long enough, it begins to shape your identity. This audiobook is built around a simple belief. One book, read slowly and consistently, is more powerful than 10 books rushed through. Because transformation isn't about information, it's about integration. Reading 30 pages a day won't impress anyone, but done quietly, without skipping days, without waiting for motivation, it does something far more valuable. It trains patience, it builds discipline, it rewires how you think under pressure. You don't notice the change at first. That's the point. Just like physical training, the real progress happens beneath the surface, in your nervous system, your habits, your inner dialogue. You start responding instead of reacting. You start choosing principles over impulses. You start trusting yourself more because your actions feel aligned. And one day, without any clear moment of realization, you recognize that you're not thinking the same way anymore. This audiobook is not a list meant to impress you. Signed, it's an invitation to slow down, to stop chasing the next idea, to stop looking for shortcuts, to give a small number of powerful books the one thing they actually need to work. Time. Over the next hour, you won't hear exaggerated promises. You won't hear quick hacks or dramatic claims. What you'll hear instead is a framework for quiet change. How to read without motivation. How to stay with ideas long enough for them to shape your decisions. How to recognize the moment when books stop being entertainment and start becoming guidance. This is not about becoming smarter. It's about becoming steadier, more grounded, more intentional, more clear about what actually matters. If you stay with this audiobook, you won't walk away feeling inspired for a day. You'll walk away with a different relationship to reading and to time. And when that relationship, maintained for months, can change how you think about life itself. Not loudly, not quickly, but permanently. Stay with this. Chapter 1. Why most books don't change. Books fail people far more often than people fail books. That sounds uncomfortable, but it's true. Most readers blame themselves quietly. They assume they lack discipline, intelligence, or consistency. They think something is wrong with them because the book didn't work. But the real issue is almost never effort. It's approach. Books are treated like short-term experiences instead of long-term influences. They're opened with excitement, consumed quickly, and then replaced by the next recommendation. The reader moves on, carrying fragments of ideas, but no lasting shift in thinking. The book becomes something that happened, not something that stayed. Change doesn't happen that way. The human mind doesn't transform through exposure. It transforms through repetition and integration. The ideas need time to echo. They need friction. They need to collide with real decisions, real emotions, and real resistance. Most books never get that chance. People read while waiting for something to happen. They read while distracted. They read with one eye on the clock and the other on what comes next. They rush to finish instead of allowing the ideas to slow them down. When reading becomes consumption, depth disappears. The brain treats rushed reading like noise. Interesting noise, sometimes even inspiring noise, but still noise. And noise doesn't change behavior, it only entertains it. Think about how habits actually form. No habit forms because you learned something once. Habits form because something repeats until it becomes familiar, then automatic. The same is true for beliefs, and a belief only becomes real when it shows up without being invited. Books that change people don't shout new ideas, they quietly replace old ones. But replacement requires space. When you move from one book to the next too quickly, nothing gets replaced. Everything stays theoretical. You understand more, but you don't become different. This is why so many intelligent, well-read people still struggle with the same patterns for years. They know what to do. They know how to think better. They know what matters. But knowledge without time is fragile. It collapses under stress. The moment life applies pressure, the mind defaults to whatever it has practiced the most. Not what it learned last week. Not what sounded convincing. What it has rehearsed quietly, repeatedly, over time. This is where most reading strategies fail. They optimize for volume instead of impact. They reward finishing instead of staying. They prioritize novelty over depth. Finishing a book feels productive. Staying with a book feels slow. And slow doesn't feel impressive. Yet every real change you admire in others happens slowly, quietly, without witnesses. People who think clearly under pressure didn't get there by collecting ideas. They lived with a few principles long enough for those principles to become instinct. Books are meant to train instinct, not impress intellect. But instinct cannot be rushed. When you read a book too quickly, you're borrowing someone else's thinking temporarily. When you read slowly, repeatedly, and with intention, you begin to install that thinking as part of your own internal system. That's a very different process. One produces insight. The other produces identity. Most books don't change people because they are never allowed to move beyond insight. Insight feels good. It feels like progress. It gives the illusion of growth without demanding discomfort. Integration feels different. Integration is uncomfortable. It requires sitting with ideas that challenge how you already live. It requires noticing contradictions between what you believe and how you act. It requires patience. That patience is what most readers never practice. Instead of asking, how can this idea shape my decisions? They ask, what should I read next? Momentum replaces meaning. And over time, reading becomes another form of distraction, productive on the surface, empty underneath. This isn't a failure of intelligence, it's a misunderstanding of how change works. The mind doesn't respond to information the way it responds to familiarity. Familiarity creates trust. Trust creates behavior. An idea you've lived with for months feels safer than an idea you just discovered, even if the new idea is better. The brain prefers the familiar over the correct. That's why change feels slow, and that's why books require commitment, not excitement. The books that actually change people are often reread, not because they're complex, but because they're foundational. Each time you return to them, you notice something different, not because the book changed, but because you did. That's the kind of relationship most people never develop with books. They treat them as events instead of companions. And when books are treated as events, their influence expires quickly. To allow a book to change you, you must allow it to stay present long after the last page. You must let it interrupt your thinking in ordinary moments. You must let it challenge you when no one is watching. This is why time matters more than motivation. Motivation creates a strong start. Time creates a strong foundation. A motivated reader may finish 10 books in a month. A disciplined reader may stay with one book for 6 months. Only one of those readers is likely to think differently a year later. Depth always beats speed in the long run. Not because speed is bad, but because depth rewires patterns instead of decorating them. Books don't change people because people rarely give them permission to do so. They don't slow down enough. They don't revisit ideas. They don't allow silence between pages. They want transformation without disruption. But disruption is the point. A good book is supposed to disturb your assumptions. It's supposed to linger. It's supposed to make you uncomfortable in subtle ways. If a book leaves you unchanged, it was either the wrong book or you didn't stay with it long enough. This audiobook is built on a different philosophy. Instead of asking how many books you should read, it asks how deeply you're willing to let one book influence you. Instead of focusing on what's new, it focuses on what lasts. Because the goal of reading is not to collect ideas, it's to become someone who thinks differently when it matters. And that only happens when you stop rushing toward the next page and start allowing the right ideas to settle. Slowly, quietly, permanently. Chapter 2. One book is enough if you stay long enough. There is a belief quietly holding many readers back. The belief that progress comes from adding more. More books, more ideas, more perspectives. It sounds reasonable. It even sounds intelligent. But in practice, it creates a shallow relationship with knowledge. Because the mind does not grow stronger by accumulation. It grows stronger by commitment. One book, stayed with long enough, can reshape how you see the world more deeply than a shelf full of unfinished insights. The problem is that staying feels uncomfortable. Staying means resisting novelty. Staying means rereading pages you already understand intellectually but haven't lived through yet. Staying means trusting that depth will eventually outperform speed. Most people don't quit books because the books are bad. They quit because the excitement fades. And when excitement fades, they assume the value is gone. But excitement was never the value. Excitement is only the invitation. The real work of a book begins after the emotional reaction disappears. When the sentences no longer feel new. When the ideas stop feeling clever. When you think you already got it. That's exactly when the book starts working on you. Because repetition is what trains the mind to recognize patterns. And patterns are what shape decisions. A single idea, revisited often enough, begins to appear automatically in moments that matter. Under stress, under temptation, under pressure. That's when you know an idea has moved from knowledge into instinct. Most readers never reach that point because they leave too early. They treat reading like a highlight reel instead of a practice. They want the takeaway, the quote, the summary. They want something they can remember, not something they have to live with. But living with an idea is what changes behavior. When you stay with one book for weeks or months, something subtle happens. You stop reading for information and start reading for alignment. You begin to notice where the book agrees with your life and where it quietly exposes contradictions. Those contradictions are uncomfortable. They force questions most people avoid. Why do I know this, but still act differently? Why do I admire this principle, but resist applying it? Why does this idea feel true, yet inconvenient? These questions don't arise from fast reading. They arise from sustained exposure. A book read slowly becomes a mirror, and most people don't want mirrors. They want motivation. Motivation makes you feel capable. Mirrors make you feel responsible. That responsibility is why one book is enough, if you stay. Because staying removes excuses. You can't say you didn't understand. You can't say you didn't have time. You can't say you didn't know better. All that remains is choice. When people jump from book to book, they dilute that responsibility. Each new book offers a fresh emotional reset, a new chance to feel inspired without being tested. Staying removes that comfort. The same ideas keep returning. The same standards keep applying. The same principles keep asking to be honored. And over time, resistance weakens, not through force, but through familiarity. The mind stops arguing. The ego stops negotiating. The ideas simply become normal. This is how beliefs form, not through persuasion, but through presence. One book, reread and reflected on, slowly becomes part of your internal dialogue. You begin to hear its language when making decisions. Its logic shapes how you interpret events. Its principles influence what you tolerate and what you walk away from. You don't announce this change, you don't feel it happening. You notice it later when a situation that once would have triggered you no longer does. When a decision that once felt difficult now feels obvious. When your reactions feel quieter, steadier, more intentional. This is not because you read more. It's because you stayed longer. Depth requires boredom at first. That's something few people are willing to accept. The early stages of staying with one book feel repetitive. You recognize the arguments. You remember the examples. You think there's nothing left to extract. But repetition doesn't exist to teach you something new. It exists to teach you something true. Truth needs reinforcement. The mind resists change not because it doesn't understand, but because it prefers the familiar. Repetition slowly makes new thinking feel familiar enough to trust. This is why disciplines like philosophy, meditation, and training all rely on repetition. Not because progress is slow, but because permanence requires it. A book that changes you does so by becoming predictable. Predictable in its standards. Predictable in its principles. Predictable in the way it frames the world. That predictability creates stability. And stability is what allows clarity to emerge under pressure. When people say a book changed their life, it's rarely because of a single moment of insight. It's because that book quietly accompanied them through enough moments to shape how they responded. One book is enough if you stay long enough to let it argue with you, challenge you, and eventually become part of you. This audiobook is not asking you to abandon curiosity or stop learning. It's asking you to choose commitment over accumulation, to stop chasing the next idea long enough for the right one to take root. Because a mind shaped by one clear framework will always outperform a mind cluttered with many unfinished ones. Not because it knows more, but because it knows what to stand on. And that is what staying gives you. Chapter 3. Reading that reshapes your inner dialogue. The most important voice in your life is not the one you hear from others. It's the one that speaks when no one else is around. That voice narrates your failures. It comments on your choices. It explains what things mean and what they say about you. And for most people, that voice was not consciously chosen. It was inherited. It was shaped by early experiences, repeated environments, emotional reactions, and unconscious conclusions made long before clarity existed. Books that truly change people do not just add ideas to the mind. They interrupt that inner voice. They don't argue loudly. They don't shout affirmations. They don't try to overpower your existing beliefs. They replace the tone. At first, this feels subtle. You're reading a sentence and something about it lingers. Not because it's poetic, but because it feels steady, grounded, unemotional in a way that feels unfamiliar. That unfamiliar calm is important. Most inner dialogue is reactive. It judges quickly. It assumes danger. It personalizes everything. A good book introduces a different rhythm. It pauses before reacting. It separates events from interpretation. It speaks in principles instead of impulses. The more time you spend with that tone, the more your own thinking begins to borrow it. Not intentionally, not forcefully, naturally. This is how reading reshapes the inner dialogue. You don't wake up one day with a new personality. You wake up one day and realize your thoughts feel less chaotic, less dramatic, less urgent. You start noticing space between stimulus and response. Something happens. And instead of reacting immediately, a sentence you've read before quietly surfaces. Not as a quote, but as a way of seeing. That's when reading stops being intellectual and starts becoming functional. Most people think change happens when thoughts become more positive. That's not true. Change happens when thoughts become more accurate. Books that change you don't tell you to feel better. They teach you to see more clearly. They question assumptions you didn't realize you were making. They point out patterns you accepted as normal. They reframe struggle without removing responsibility. Over time, this changes how you speak to yourself in moments of pressure. The inner dialogue becomes less emotional and more observational. And instead of "this is unfair," it becomes "this is happening." Instead of "I can't handle this," it becomes "this is uncomfortable." Instead of "this defines me," it becomes "this is a moment." These shifts sound small. They are not. They change everything, because the way you interpret events determines how much power they have over you. Most suffering is amplified by the story we tell ourselves about what's happening. Books that reshape the inner dialogue don't eliminate difficulty. They reduce distortion, and reduced distortion creates resilience. This is why speed reading and surface-level summaries fail to produce real change. You don't need more concepts. You need fewer, clearer interpretations. That clarity only develops when the mind hears the same perspective repeatedly, in different contexts over time. When you read slowly, certain phrases begin to echo internally. They show up when you're tired, when you're disappointed, when you're tempted to react impulsively. At first, you might resist them. They sound too calm, too detached, too disciplined. But over time, that calm starts to feel like strength. You begin to trust it. The inner dialogue shifts from emotional commentary to quiet guidance. Not because you forced it to change, but because you exposed it to a better example long enough. Books don't argue with your inner voice. They outlast it. And when they do, the internal environment changes. This is why many people feel different after months of consistent reading, even if they can't explain exactly why. Their reactions are slower, their decisions are cleaner, their emotional spikes are shorter, the mind feels less crowded. That's not motivation. That's conditioning. The inner dialogue is a habit, and like all habits, it changes through repetition, not intention. When you repeatedly expose your mind to a calm, principled, grounded way of thinking, it begins to adopt that tone as default. Not because it's trying to improve, but because it's familiar. This familiarity is what allows clarity under pressure. In stressful moments, the mind reaches for what it knows best. If it knows chaos, it reacts chaotically. If it knows steadiness, it steadies itself. Reading is training for that moment, not the quiet moment on the couch, the loud moment in real life, the moment when someone challenges you, the moment when plans fall apart, the moment when emotions demand immediate action. A reshaped inner dialogue doesn't silence emotion, it contextualizes it. You still feel frustration, You still feel fear. You still feel uncertainty. But those feelings no longer run the conversation. They're acknowledged, not obeyed. This is the quiet power of reading done properly. It doesn't make you more expressive. It makes you more deliberate. Over time, you notice that your self-talk becomes less about defending your ego and more about navigating reality. You stop arguing with what is. You stop narrating failure as identity. You stop exaggerating setbacks into conclusions. None of this feels dramatic. That's why it works. Dramatic change rarely lasts. Subtle change compounds. The books that reshape your inner dialogue don't give you confidence. They give you orientation. You know where you stand. You know what matters. You know what doesn't require reaction. And that knowledge becomes automatic. This chapter is not about choosing the right words to say to yourself. It's about choosing the right voices to live with long enough that your own voice evolves. If you stay with the right books, your inner dialogue will not become louder. It will become quieter. And in that quiet, you'll find something far more useful than motivation. You'll find control, not the kind that dominates circumstances, the kind that steadies you within them. Chapter 4. The Discipline of Reading. Without motivation. Most people wait for the right mood to read. They wait to feel inspired. They wait to feel calm. They wait for a moment when reading feels natural and easy. That moment rarely comes. And when it does, it doesn't stay. Motivation is unreliable by design. It rises when things are new and disappears when things become repetitive. That's not a personal flaw. It's how the mind works. This is why motivation-based reading never lasts long enough to create change. Because transformation requires consistency long after excitement fades. The readers who actually change are not the ones who feel like reading every day. They are the ones who read anyway. They don't read because it feels good. They read because it's part of how they live. This distinction matters more than people realize. Reading with motivation treats books like entertainment. Reading with discipline treats books like training. Training doesn't require excitement, it requires attendance. Showing up when you don't feel like it is what builds capacity. Not just physical capacity, but mental stability. When you read without motivation, something important happens. The ego steps back. You're no longer reading to feel inspired, impressive, or productive. You're reading because you decided to. And that decision, repeated quietly, strengthens self-trust. Self-trust is built when actions are not dependent on mood. Most people don't trust themselves because they've trained themselves to act only when they feel like it. Over time, the mind learns that intentions are negotiable. Discipline reverses that pattern. When you read consistently, even on days when the pages feel dull, the mind begins to associate reading with identity instead of emotion. You stop asking, "Do I feel like reading today?" You start asking, "When will I read today?" That shift changes everything, because habits anchored in identity are resilient. Habits anchored in emotion are fragile. This is why 30 pages a day works. Not because of the number, but because of the agreement it creates with yourself. It's small enough to be manageable. It's consistent enough to matter. You're not trying to extract something profound every session. You're simply showing up. And showing up repeatedly does something motivation never can. It normalizes effort. Effort stops feeling dramatic. Consistency stops feeling heroic. Reading becomes quiet, ordinary, and stable. That stability is what allows ideas to sink deeper. When reading becomes routine, your mind stops resisting it. There's no internal debate, no negotiation, no friction. You sit, you read, you move on. That lack of drama is exactly what makes the habit durable. Motivation creates spikes. Discipline creates systems. Systems change people. Most people underestimate how much energy they waste deciding whether to act. Every internal debate drains attention. Every hesitation reinforces uncertainty. Discipline removes those decisions. You don't decide to read each day. You've already decided. That frees mental space for reflection. And reflection is where books do their real work. Reading without motivation also changes how you engage with difficulty. When a book challenges you emotionally or intellectually, motivation would normally push you away. You'd reach for something easier, something lighter, something that feels better. Discipline keeps you present. You sit with ideas that make you uncomfortable. You allow disagreement to linger. You don't rush to resolution. That discomfort is not a problem. It's a signal. It means the book is touching something real. Most growth happens in moments like these, not when you feel inspired, but when you feel resistant and continue anyway. This is why people who rely on motivation rarely finish the books that could help them the most. Those books require patience. They require humility. They require consistency. They don't reward speed. Discipline gives you access to that depth. Over time, reading without motivation builds a different relationship with effort itself. Effort stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like structure. Structure reduces anxiety. And when your day contains a few non-negotiable anchors, reading, movement, reflection, the rest of life feels less chaotic. You don't need to control everything. You only need to honor a few commitments. That sense of control is quiet but powerful. It doesn't come from forcing productivity. It comes from reliability. You become someone who does what they said they would do, even when no one is watching. That integrity changes how you see yourself, and how you see yourself changes how you act in every other area of life. Reading without motivation also removes pressure. You're not trying to have a breakthrough. You're not trying to feel different immediately. You're not measuring progress day by day. You're allowing time to do its work. This patience protects you from disappointment. When you expect reading to change you quickly, you constantly evaluate whether it's working. When you commit to reading as a practice, evaluation fades. You trust the process, and trust allows you to stay. Months later, you realize something has shifted. Your attention span is longer, your reactions are slower, your thinking is clearer. Not because you pushed harder, but because you stayed consistent. Discipline compounds quietly. Most people quit long before compounding begins. They stop because the change isn't visible yet. They stop because it feels repetitive. They stop because something new catches their attention. But repetition is what creates depth. The mind learns through exposure. The more often an idea appears, the more weight it carries. And this is why disciplined reading shapes judgment over time. You don't just recall ideas. You feel them. They become reference points. When faced with choices, your mind doesn't scramble for advice. It recognizes patterns it has seen before. That recognition is the reward. Not excitement, not inspiration, orientation. Reading without motivation builds a quiet strength, the strength to continue without applause, the strength to invest in outcomes you can't see yet. That strength carries into other areas of life. You stop relying on mood to determine behavior. You stop waiting to feel ready. You stop mistaking comfort for alignment. You act because it's time to act. This chapter is not an argument against motivation. Motivation is useful. It can start things. But discipline is what finishes them. And in the context of reading, a discipline is what allows books to become more than words. It allows them to become influence, not through intensity, through presence, day after day, page after page, quietly shaping how you think, long after motivation has moved on. Chapter 5. When books start changing your decisions. The moment books begin to change, you is not dramatic. There is no sudden realization, no clear line between before and after, no announcement inside your head that something has shifted. The change reveals itself quietly, through decisions, not the big ones people talk about, the small ones no one notices. How you respond to a message that irritates you, whether you speak or stay silent in a tense moment. How long you sit with discomfort before trying to escape it. These moments are where books either live or disappear. Most people assume change happens at the level of belief, that once you think differently, action will follow. In reality, action changes first, almost without permission. You don't decide to behave differently. You notice that you already are. A situation appears that would have triggered a familiar reaction. The same internal tension rises, but instead of acting immediately, there is a pause. That pause is everything. It's the space books create, not through force, but through familiarity. When you live with the same ideas long enough, they begin to show up automatically. Not as quotes, not as advice, as orientation. Your mind recognizes the situation before emotion takes over. You see consequences sooner. You recognize patterns faster. You sense when an impulse is temporary and when a decision is permanent. This doesn't feel like effort. It feels like clarity. The decision itself may still be difficult, but it feels cleaner, less chaotic, less emotional. That's how you know reading has crossed the threshold from learning into living. Most people never experience this because they stop too early. They read until they understand, not until they change. Understanding feels like completion. Change requires patience. When books start influencing decisions, they don't override desire. They contextualize it. You still want things that aren't good for you. You still feel urges that don't align with your long-term values. But now, those urges don't feel urgent. You can see them for what they are, temporary signals, not commands. That distinction is critical. The ability to separate impulse from instruction is the foundation of self-control. And books build that ability slowly by repeatedly exposing you to long-term thinking. Each time you choose the slower, steadier option, you reinforce the change, not because the choice was heroic, but because it was consistent. Over time, these small decisions accumulate. You stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. You stop engaging in conflicts that lead nowhere. You stop saying yes just to avoid discomfort. None of this happens because you became more aggressive or confident. It happens because you became clearer. Clarity reduces hesitation. When your internal framework is strong, decisions require less emotional energy. You're not negotiating with yourself constantly. You're not seeking validation for choices you already understand. You act, then move on. This is why people who read deeply often appear calm under pressure. They're not calmer because they suppress emotion. They're calmer because fewer decisions feel ambiguous. Books that shape decisions don't make you rigid. They make you selective. You learn what deserves attention and what doesn't. You recognize which battles cost more than they're worth. You understand that restraint is often more powerful than reaction. These lessons don't feel inspiring, they feel practical. And practicality is what sustains change. At this stage, reading becomes less about personal growth and more about alignment. You're no longer asking, how can this book improve me? You're asking, does this idea belong in my life? That question filters everything. Some ideas stay, some ideas leave. Some ideas require time before they're accepted. This discernment is a sign of maturity. You're not chasing improvement, you're refining direction. Books become tools for calibration rather than motivation, and calibration affects decisions immediately. You choose environments differently. You choose people more carefully. You choose commitments with more intention. These choices don't make life easier in the short term. They often make it quieter, simpler, and more demanding. But they reduce regret. Regret comes from acting without alignment. Alignment comes from clear internal standards. Books provide those standards when they're given enough time. One of the clearest signs that reading is changing you is this. You begin to disappoint people more often, not because you've become careless, but because you've stopped overextending yourself. You say no without long explanations. You disengage without hostility. You walk away without drama. These decisions would have felt impossible before. Now they feel necessary. This is not selfishness, it's responsibility. Responsibility to your time, responsibility to your energy, responsibility to the life you're quietly building. Books don't teach you what to think. They teach you how to choose, and choice is where character forms. When decisions change consistently, identity follows. You don't need to announce that you've changed. Others notice through your boundaries, your pace, your responses. The person who reacts less but acts more decisively. The person who doesn't rush but doesn't stall. The person who listens carefully and speaks intentionally. That person wasn't created by motivation. They were shaped by time. Time spent with ideas that valued clarity over comfort. Time spent reflecting instead of reacting. Time spent reading when nothing felt exciting. When books reach this level of influence, you stop measuring progress. You trust it. You trust that the decisions you're making today are aligned with the person you're becoming. And that trust creates stability. Stability allows momentum. Momentum sustains change. This is where transformation becomes self-reinforcing. Not because life becomes easy, but because decisions stop feeling random. They feel owned. And ownership is the quiet reward of reading done right. Not information, not inspiration, direction, clear enough to follow. Chapter 6. Why most people quit right before change happens. There is a point in every meaningful process where nothing seems to be working. No visible progress, no emotional reward, no clear evidence that the effort matters. This is where most people stop. Not because the process failed, but because the feedback disappeared. Early stages are deceptive. At the beginning, reading feels productive. You notice new ideas. You feel sharper. You feel different. The mind rewards novelty with energy. Then novelty fades. The pages start to feel familiar. The ideas repeat themselves. The excitement disappears, and with it, the sense of movement. This moment is dangerous because it looks like stagnation. But in reality, it's the transition point from surface learning to internal change. Most people misinterpret this phase. They assume they've extracted all the value. They assume the book has nothing left to offer. They assume it's time to move on. What's actually happening is quieter. The mind has stopped reacting and started absorbing. And absorption feels boring. Change does not feel dramatic when it's becoming permanent. Think about physical training. The first few weeks bring visible changes. Muscles respond quickly. Motivation stays high. Then progress slows. Results become less obvious. The body adapts. That's when training starts to matter. The same applies to reading. When ideas stop feeling new, they begin to compete with existing habits. They push against old thinking patterns. They test whether they'll be adopted or rejected. This internal resistance is subtle. You feel less interested. You feel less engaged. You feel tempted to switch to something easier. That temptation is not a signal to stop. It's a signal that the book has reached a deeper layer. Most people never push past this layer. They quit when reading stops being stimulating and starts being formative. Formation requires repetition. Repetition requires tolerance for boredom. Boredom requires patience. Patience is rare. In a culture built around instant feedback, patience feels unproductive. If something doesn't feel rewarding, it feels pointless. But the most important changes offer delayed rewards. They don't announce themselves. They don't provide immediate proof. They don't compete well with distraction. This is why people abandon practices that would benefit them the most. They don't quit because they lack discipline. They quit because they expect progress to feel exciting. When reading stops feeling exciting, it starts reshaping assumptions. That reshaping happens beneath awareness. You're not conscious of it because consciousness prefers novelty. The subconscious prefers consistency, and change happens in the subconscious first. This is why people often realize they've changed only in hindsight. They look back at an old reaction and recognize distance. They remember a past fear and feel indifference. They revisit an old problem and wonder why it once felt so overwhelming. The change didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated, but accumulation is invisible while it's happening. This invisibility creates doubt. Doubt whispers that you're wasting time, that you should try something new, that this isn't working. Most people listen to that voice, not because it's correct, but because it's familiar. The mind prefers movement over stillness, even if the movement leads nowhere. Staying with one book during this phase feels like standing still. But standing still is exactly what allows integration. Integration doesn't happen while you're chasing the next insight. It happens when ideas have time to settle into the background of your thinking, when they become reference points rather than focal points. This is why 6 months matters. Not because 6 months is special, but because it's long enough to outlast novelty and short enough to remain realistic. Most people quit around the point where effort no longer produces emotional feedback. That's the exact point where discipline replaces motivation. And discipline is what carries you through the silent phase. The silent phase is where beliefs solidify. Not beliefs you repeat, but beliefs you act on without thinking. At this stage, reading feels ordinary. You read because it's time to read. You reflect because it's part of the rhythm. You don't look for breakthroughs. You trust the process. That trust separates people who change from people who collect experiences. People who quit early often mistake awareness for transformation. They say, "I already know this," and move on. Knowing is not the same as living. Living requires time under the same principles. It requires allowing ideas to confront you in different moods, different circumstances, different seasons of life. Only then do ideas prove whether they belong. Quitting early protects the ego. It allows you to feel informed without being challenged. It allows you to stay comfortable. Staying exposes gaps between belief and behavior. That exposure is uncomfortable, which is why most people unconsciously avoid it. They keep searching instead of settling. They keep reading instead of practicing. They keep moving instead of deepening. This constant motion feels like growth, but it's often avoidance. True change asks for stillness. It asks you to remain present when there's nothing new to distract you. It asks you to tolerate repetition. It asks you to trust time. This is the phase where reading becomes an act of faith. Not faith in the book, but faith in yourself. Faith that showing up consistently matters even when results are invisible. Faith that depth will eventually outperform novelty. People who make it through this phase rarely talk about it. They don't announce discipline. They don't document patience. They don't dramatize consistency. They simply keep going. And months later, their thinking feels different, more grounded, more stable, less reactive. They don't trace the change to a single moment. They trace it to a decision they kept honoring. The decision not to quit when things felt flat. This is where most transformations quietly fail. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the middle. The middle is where commitment is tested. The middle is where motivation disappears. The middle is where discipline decides who continues. If you stay through this phase, reading stops being something you do. It becomes part of who you are. And from that point forward, change no longer depends on excitement. It depends on alignment. Alignment with time. Alignment with patience. Alignment with the long view. Most people never experience this. Not because it's difficult, but because it's quiet. And quiet work rarely gets attention, but it always gets results. Chapter 7. Living with new ideas until they become you. There is a difference between understanding an idea and living inside it. Understanding is mental, living is behavioral. Most people stop at understanding. They nod while reading. They agree with the logic. They recognize the truth in the words, and then they return to life unchanged. Not because they rejected the idea, but because they never allowed it to stay close enough to influence daily behavior. Ideas only become powerful when they move from the foreground of thought into the background of identity. That transition takes time. When you live with an idea long enough, it stops feeling like advice and starts feeling like orientation. You no longer ask whether it's right. You act from it automatically. This is the stage where reading becomes less visible and more influential. You don't talk about what you're reading. You don't quote it. You don't feel the need to explain it. You simply move differently. Living with an idea means letting it accompany you into ordinary moments. Moments that don't feel philosophical or important. Standing in line, answering emails, choosing whether to speak or remain silent. This is where most ideas fade, because they were never meant to survive the mundane. Only ideas that can live in ordinary moments are strong enough to shape a life. When you stay with a book for months, you stop treating its ideas as special. They become normal, expected, familiar. That familiarity is crucial. The mind resists what feels foreign. It obeys what feels normal. Living with an idea long enough makes it feel normal. You begin to measure situations differently, and not by how they make you feel, but by how they align with principles you've internalized. You stop asking, "What do I want right now?" You start asking, "What makes sense long term?" This shift doesn't feel dramatic. It feels obvious. That's how you know the idea has become part of you. Ideas that haven't integrated still feel like choices. Ideas that have integrated feel like defaults. Default behavior reveals identity. When someone truly changes, they don't announce it. They don't perform it. They don't defend it. They simply behave consistently. Living with ideas also means allowing them to challenge you repeatedly. A principle only becomes yours after it has confronted your habits and survived. At first, you resist, you rationalize, you negotiate, you look for exceptions. But when the same idea returns again and again, through reading, more reflection, and experience, resistance weakens. Not because the idea wins an argument, because it outlasts your excuses. Time favors truth. This is why rushing through books undermines change. You never give ideas enough time to test you. You leave before the confrontation happens. Living with ideas requires staying long enough for friction to appear. Friction is not failure. It's proof that the idea matters. If an idea never challenges you, it will never change you. But challenge alone is not enough. The idea must also be present when decisions are made. This is why consistent reading matters more than intense reading. Consistency keeps ideas nearby. When ideas are nearby, they influence behavior. You don't need to remember the exact wording. You don't need to recall the chapter. You feel the direction. Direction is what guides action under uncertainty. Living with ideas also reshapes how you relate to others. You become less reactive to opinions, less defensive in disagreement, less dependent on validation, not because you became detached, but because you became anchored. Anchored people don't drift with every emotional current. They move deliberately, and that deliberateness changes relationships quietly. You speak with more restraint. You listen more carefully. You choose when engagement is necessary and when it's not. This is not withdrawal, it's selectivity. Selectivity comes from knowing what matters. Books that stay with you long enough help clarify that. Over time, ideas stop feeling external. You don't feel like you're applying something you learned. You feel like you're expressing who you are. This is the difference between behavior change and identity change. Behavior change requires effort. Identity change requires alignment. Alignment happens when ideas are lived with long enough to shape how you see yourself. You begin to think, This is how I do things, rather than this is something I should try. That subtle shift removes friction. Action becomes easier, not because it's comfortable, but because it's consistent with self-image. Living with ideas also builds integrity. Integrity is not about being perfect, it's about being coherent. When thoughts, values, and actions point in the same direction, internal conflict decreases. You spend less energy justifying behavior, less energy managing regret, less energy explaining yourself. That energy is freed for focus. Focus allows depth. Depth allows mastery. This is why the end goal of reading is not knowledge. It's coherence. A coherent mind doesn't need constant motivation. It doesn't chase every new idea. It doesn't panic under pressure. It relies on a small number of deeply integrated principles. Those principles were not adopted quickly. They were lived with, month after month, decision after decision, quietly. Living with ideas also teaches patience. You stop expecting immediate results. You stop measuring progress emotionally. You trust slow improvement. This patience spills into other areas of life. Work becomes steadier. Relationships become clearer. Goals become less frantic. You're no longer trying to become someone else. You're becoming more of who you already are, just with better direction. This is the stage where books stop feeling like tools and start feeling like companions. Not because you depend on them, but because they helped shape how you navigate life. You don't read to escape. You read to orient. And orientation is what allows you to move through complexity without losing yourself. Living with ideas until they become you is not glamorous. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. It doesn't produce quick stories, but it produces something far more valuable. Stability, a stable way of thinking that doesn't collapse under stress. A stable sense of self that doesn't require constant reinforcement. That stability is the quiet result of time spent living with the right ideas. Not visiting them. Living with them. Until they stop feeling like ideas at all and start feeling like home. Chapter 8. 6 months later, you are not the same person. If you're looking for a clear moment when everything changes, you won't find it. There is no finish line where you suddenly feel transformed. No day where you wake up and think, now it worked. 6 months later, change doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in contrast. You notice it when something happens that would have unsettled you before, and it doesn't. When pressure appears and your response is measured instead of emotional. When a familiar problem shows up, but it feels smaller than it used to. The difference is not dramatic, it's structural. Your thinking has shifted underneath the surface. You don't feel smarter, you don't feel superior, you feel steadier. And steadiness is one of the rarest forms of strength. 6 months of consistent reading doesn't make life easier. It makes life clearer. You still face uncertainty. You still experience disappointment. You still feel resistance. But these experiences no longer define your inner state. They pass through instead of taking over. That's how you know something has changed. Earlier, emotion decided direction. Now direction decides how emotion is handled. This is not emotional numbness, it's emotional proportion. You respond appropriately instead of reflexively. 6 months ago, your mind reacted first and explained later. Now, it observes first and responds with intention. That shift alone changes the quality of a life. Because most problems are not caused by circumstances. They're caused by unexamined reactions. When reactions slow down, problems shrink. You begin to trust yourself more. Not because you always make perfect decisions, but because you understand why you're making them. Clarity builds trust. You no longer second-guess every choice. You no longer replay conversations endlessly. You no longer need constant reassurance. Your decisions feel owned. Ownership removes anxiety. This is one of the most overlooked outcomes of deep reading. Not knowledge, but confidence rooted in understanding. The confidence that comes from knowing your thinking has a foundation. 6 months later, your relationship with time also changes. You stop rushing unnecessarily. You stop filling every gap with stimulation. You become more comfortable with silence. Silence no longer feels empty. It feels useful. You think more before speaking. You choose words more carefully. You allow moments to unfold without interference. This makes you appear calm to others. Not because you're passive, but because you're grounded. Grounded people don't need to prove movement. They move when it matters. Your attention becomes sharper, not scattered across every new idea or opinion, focused on what aligns with your principles. You consume less noise, you tolerate less distraction, you protect your mental space more deliberately. This doesn't make life smaller, it makes it cleaner. 6 months later, you don't crave motivation the way you used to. Motivation was a substitute for direction. Direction is now internal. You don't need to be pushed. You know where you're going, and when you don't know, you're comfortable admitting it. That comfort is maturity. You stop pretending certainty where there is none. You stop forcing answers before understanding. You trust time, and books trained you for this. They taught you that clarity unfolds, not appears. That understanding deepens, not rushes. This patience shows up everywhere. In work, you focus on fewer things, but execute them more carefully. In relationships, you engage more honestly, but less reactively. In challenges, you act more decisively, but without panic. None of this feels heroic. That's why it lasts. 6 months later, you are harder to manipulate, not because you're suspicious, but because you're anchored. You recognize emotional pressure. You notice when urgency is manufactured. You sense when something demands reaction without justification. You pause. That pause protects you. It protects your time. It protects your energy. It protects your direction. Books didn't give you answers. They gave you filters. Filters change everything. And with better filters, you waste less time. You engage with fewer things but more deeply. You stop chasing relevance and start cultivating substance. You also become less concerned with being understood. This is subtle but important. You explain yourself less. You justify choices less. You let actions speak longer than words, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. You know what you stand for, and that knowledge doesn't require defense. 6 months later, your inner life feels quieter, not empty, organized. Thoughts don't compete as aggressively. Emotions don't dominate decision-making. Worries don't spiral as far. You still think, you still feel, but everything has proportion. This proportionality is the result of time spent with ideas that emphasized perspective over reaction. Perspective expands when it's practiced. Books practiced it for you, page after page, day after day, quietly training your mind to see wider, slower, deeper. You don't attribute this change to a single book or moment. You attribute it to consistency, to showing up even when it felt boring, to staying when nothing felt new, to trusting that something invisible was happening. And it was. 6 months later, you don't feel finished. You feel oriented. You know which direction matters. You know which distractions don't. You know when to act and when to wait. This is not enlightenment. It's alignment. Alignment between thought, action, and time. That alignment is what allows growth to continue without force. You're no longer trying to change yourself. You're allowing yourself to evolve. Books didn't transform you overnight. They reshaped how you move through life. And that reshaping is permanent, not because it was intense, but because it was sustained. If you continue reading the way you have, slowly, consistently, without chasing novelty, you won't need to look for change. You'll recognize it in how you live, in how you respond, in how you choose, in how you remain steady when others rush. 6 months later, you're not a new person. You're a clearer one. And clarity, once earned, doesn't fade. If you've made it this far, nothing dramatic has happened. No breakthrough moment, no sudden rush of motivation, no promise that everything will be easier tomorrow. And that is exactly the point. Because the kind of change this audiobook points toward was never meant to feel explosive. It was meant to feel stable. Real transformation rarely announces itself. It settles in. It shows up in how you respond instead of react, in how you choose instead of drift, in how you remain steady when life applies pressure. This audiobook was never about convincing you to read more books. It was about changing your relationship with time, attention, and thinking. About understanding that growth is not a moment, it's a direction. And direction is maintained quietly, through small decisions repeated consistently. You don't need to overhaul your life. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to chase constant improvement. You only need to stay. Stay with a few ideas long enough for them to shape how you see. Stay with a few practices long enough for them to feel normal. Stay with the discipline long enough for motivation to become irrelevant. Reading, done this way, stops being an activity. It becomes a rhythm that steadies your thinking, a rhythm that slows your reactions, a rhythm that builds clarity without noise. You don't read to escape reality. You read to engage with it more clearly. And clarity changes everything, not because it gives you answers, but because it improves the quality of your questions. Better questions lead to better decisions. Better decisions compound into a better life. Quietly. If you choose one thing after this audiobook, then let it be this. Choose consistency over intensity. Choose depth over volume. Choose patience over excitement. Read even when nothing feels new. Read even when progress feels invisible. Read even when motivation disappears. Because what you are building cannot be seen while it's forming. It will be seen later, in hindsight, in contrast, in the way your thinking no longer collapses under pressure. And when that happens, you won't trace the change to this audiobook. You'll trace it to a choice you kept honoring. The choice to slow down, the choice to stay, the choice to trust time. If you know someone who feels overwhelmed, distracted, or stuck in the same patterns, share this with them. Not as advice, as an invitation to stop rushing toward change and start allowing it. Quietly, consistently, completely. Thank you for staying.